the time of enslavement, darkness, and violence, they risked their young lives. On their shoulders, they were carrying Poland.
Nazywam się Anna Stupnicka-Bando.
My name is Anna Stupnicka-Bando. I was born in 1929. I am, or rather I was, a doctor. I was an insurgent, and I am one of the righteous among the nations. I have been president of the Polish Society of the Righteous Among the Nations since 2008. I am optimistic, which I see as a crucial thing. I don't look for problems when there are none. I think somehow it will all work out against all odds.
Uważam, że jakoś to będzie, że wszystko jakoś będzie, mimo wszystko. Wychowanie w domu, no kiedyś to...
Upbringing at home, well, it used to be split into what we received at home and at school. The school, long before the war, was very much forming when it came to patriotism, because not every family had such values. My family did, because my mother was close to the army all her life. Before the war, she graduated from the School of Political Science. She worked for the military, so for me, I was raised in great reverence for Piłsudski. For example, I used to go to Belvedere, the presidential palace, for Christmas celebrations each year. Piłsudski was referred to as our grandfather. He hosted the children of army employees. I was at the last celebration with Grandfather Piłsudski at the Belvedere. It was 1935 when he died, so it must have been 1934, but he was already so sickly. But I remember this big moustache of his. I know that, as he would lean in closer to children, they would be afraid of this big moustache. Some were just terrified, but he stroked the children's heads, handed out candy, and asked each one with a funny accent, "Have you been good this year?" And I remember this little boy who stood there next to me. He was probably even younger than me. He was terribly frightened of his grandfather Piłsudski. The latter was leaning over him with this big moustache. So the boy was dumbfounded. And Grandpa asks if he has been good. And after a long pause, the boy mutters, "A little, a little." I remember it, by God, and it was so long ago, in 1934. I remember it because some of the older kids there started laughing. Grandpa began to laugh too, because the kid was terrified and barely able to give his faint answer. Still, I don't remember if he got any candy from Grandpa Piłsudski. So this is what kind of memories I have of the earliest years. In the first year of middle school, it was already during the occupation. I attended secret classes organized by Piłsudski's wife, meaning it was actually a gardening school. After all, the Germans abolished schools, higher education and other schools. Only the common schools remained, because they thought that Poles would only be needed as labor if they won the war. They also liquidated the Polish intelligentsia after all. Well, so as I was saying about education in schools, there was also a great deal of patriotism in the schools. All the celebrations, you know, those of military and civilian character, especially national ones, were celebrated. Teachers were very respectful of this.
Wojskowe, ale takie narodowe też było to bardzo przestrzegane. No początek wojny to było coś innego, bo...
It was different at the beginning of the war because my parents divorced, and I lived only with my mother. We had a housekeeper who ran the house because mother worked all day. Mother had already sent that housekeeper away 2 months before the war broke out. She put me up with the nuns in Wawr because mother already worked very long hours, and in fact, there was no one to take care of me. And when the war broke out, mother came to Wawr to the nuns there, and she told them we were leaving, so she'd come by and pick me up in 2 days, and that's what happened. When she came to pick me up, it was the early days, the first week of the outbreak of war. Sometime in September, the beginning, mother was leaving Poland with the army. We fled Poland with the army and the military staff to Romania. So we were on the way, and my grandmother was with us too. And we made it to the Romanian border, but my grandmother said that if she was to die, then only on Polish soil, and she would go no farther. Instead, she wants to return to Warsaw. So my mother decided to leave the army and come back with us. I do not know, but she was probably carrying some important documents. I do not know if it was the whole staff, but I remember there were those colonels, some old ones. We had to turn back from the border. Somehow, part of those people got across to Romania and then across. I remember when my mother bought an army horse and wagon from some farmer. And after all, money was probably no longer important. And maybe she didn't even buy that horse, but she got it. I do remember it was a military horse, but the wagon was purchased from this farmer. And with that horse and that wagon, my grandmother and I were no longer going back to Warsaw, but to the Soviet Union, because we had family there. My mother's sister lived in Brest. Well, we traveled for over a week through those villages. Was it Wolin? All the Poles of the intelligentsia and the teachers were already gone. Everything was ransacked. We spent a week on the road, and there were all sorts of stories I could not dare to tell because bandits wanted us to steal our beautiful horse. After all, it was a beautiful Lancer horse.
Wyprzędz, bo to był piękny koń ułański. Wujek załamał ręce.
My uncle looked at us with disbelief, as he could not fathom how we got across safely. Has nothing happened to you? Were you not murdered? He asked. And my mother said, no, because once, as they approached us, I told them Hania had typhoid, and another time that grandmother had it. Well then, so why did it take us so long? Uncle said it was because somebody should be riding that horse, because he wasn't used to pulling a cart. He said we should have saddled it, then we would have been here sooner. But we arrived. Brest was already the Soviet Union. I think we were there for 3 months because my mother decided, however, that we were going back to Warsaw again. And we went back to Warsaw. Crossing the green border 3 times was frightening. It would take a whole book to describe how when we would get caught in a neutral zone closer to the Soviet Union, my mother told them we were running away from the Germans. But, on the other hand, when we got caught closer to the Polish-German border from the German side, she would say we were running away from the Bolsheviks. Well, it was 1939, and it was one of the harshest winters in Poland. We had one like this in 1929 and then in 1939. So both sides kept us in that neutral zone. It was a field with such lumps of frozen ground they held us until dawn in that terrible cold. We had to walk around so as not to freeze. Because there were always a couple of people. Those guides were mainly military men. They caught us, and we waited until dawn in that terrible cold on that frozen soil. Then they took us somewhere to some post for questioning. Finally, we passed through that green border. Once we decided to go across the Bug River. It was also terrible because they saw us from 2 sides, caught us in their lights' beams and started shooting. Well, we all lay down on the bottom of that boat. Mom was covering me with her own body. We were caught again, and there were these interrogations of some kind. Somehow we survived it. I didn't even have frostbite on my hands or feet, although I was not adequately dressed for this weather. Just in time for Christmas, we arrived at my aunt's place in Warsaw, in the Żoliborz district. She was my mother's oldest sister. She was doing well because they had 2 cinemas in Żoliborz. Rich people. She was my mother's wealthiest sister. This was our family's central hub. We had to start life again from scratch there.
Trzeba było zacząć życie znowu od początku. Mama moja miała przeszłość, przecież w wojsku pracowała, więc musiała się tak trochę ukrywać.
My mother had a past. After all, she worked in the army, so she had to hide a bit, but got herself a job in charge of registration and administration in various houses in Żoliborz, the old town, and partly in the ghetto. And, of course, she immediately got drawn into the secret organization. Today I still remember. It was supposedly the Red Cross, but it was just a front. We had a tough time in the beginning. This money that Mum was getting, I don't remember if it was 500 zloty. At the time, it was a very modest salary. But because Mum was in charge of these registrations, she got these extra food stamps. So instead of 3, we got 6. For example, whoever was hungry could always come to us for that horrible wholemeal bread and for that beet marmalade. Well, somehow we lived. When she was conducting registrations in the ghetto, my mother had a pass for 2 people. A few times she took me with her to at least carry in my school briefcase a loaf of bread and some of that beet marmalade for some family in there. That's the kind of family I remember. I still remember this one man. He was a father. I think he was a shoemaker or tailor, but I no longer remember. I know there were children. 7 of these children were about a year apart, and my mother made it her goal that we always bring this bread and this marmalade to leave for them each time we went there. And some days I went, but I didn't go too often because the family and my aunt with other aunts were annoyed with my mother. Why are you dragging your daughter into this? Why? After all, there are diseases out there, lice too. Why do you need her there? And my mother didn't listen to anyone. She always did what she wanted and decided because she had access to these registrations. You know, she helped with a great deal of forged documents, not only the Jews who were already locked in the ghetto, but also those who were in the organization and were found out and needed their registration papers because if they didn't have them, you know. Of course, it was all under fake names, and based on this registration, my mother made up both for Jews and Poles. Then, having these registration documents, they went to the magistrate's office, where they showed these papers, proving they already were someone else. With those, they proceeded to get identity cards and some other documents. My mother told me once that she would take a little girl from the ghetto the next day, and so it happened.
Dziewczynkę z getta. I tak się stało.
Young, free, idealistic. Thanks to them, we live in Poland, in a free Poland, out of gratitude for Poland. Subsidized by the Polish National Foundation.